Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I'm Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We want to get back to some Lou Anarumo stuff soon, but Nate is in the middle of or grinding away on what Anarumo did in Cincinnati. I'm hoping Nate gives us answers as to why he stopped blitzing so heavily after his first 2 years. That might be a little bit too much to ask. I don't know if Nate's going all the way back to 19. For his film. If he is, then this podcast we're teasing where Nate tells us his takeaways might be like, I don't know, March.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think we can do that next week.
But we're going to get back to Anarumo, and I think Anarumo is going to come up some in what we're going to do. We've done this version of this on the pod. I don't know if every year, but we've done it for a very long time, going back to before Nate was even on the pod. I know it's something that the Cover 2 has done in the past, but just takeaways from the playoffs. We're going into the Super Bowl. I think, we could wait and just see what happens in the Super Bowl, but I think the takeaways can probably go right now. So stuff that we thought about. This is either takeaways or it's also, I think, sometimes stuff that made us think of the Colts when we were watching the playoffs is the way I sometimes do it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let Nate lead off first there.
Yeah, I guess we could just ping pong these until we run out of some good ones. I just wrote a few on the website, so it's a little bit fresh to me. I guess my biggest one that I came away with in relation to the Colts is that we have the return of the superstar running back really mattering in the NFL, or maybe just the skirting from the rooftops that it never went away, because that, of course, was the big conversation just a year and a half ago, was our constant lives covering Jonathan Taylor and a essentially contract hold-in. He'd just gotten off a Zoom call with guys like Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, and many others. And Saquon Barkley, same deal. Couldn't get the contract he wanted from the Giants. His hometown team ends up leaving in the offseason. And the irony is thinking back to that conversation and debate about, do you pay Jonathan Taylor? Do you pay any running back? Or do you, at a high level, or do you just kind of draft and replace them when they have short shelf lives and all that? The argument a lot of people made, I remember at the time, was, well, this is something the Eagles wouldn't do. Like, the forward-thinking teams wouldn't do this. And the Eagles were often the team that came up because at that point they had let Miles Sanders go. They hadn't signed one of these guys. Well, here they are. They signed Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley has carried them to a Super Bowl rematch and truly, truly carried them. Not that he's the only – obviously they made a couple of years ago. They have a very good team around him. But we're talking about a guy that just ran for 2,000 yards. It's remarkable. He's the rushing champ in the NFL this year, and then he gets into the playoffs, and in just 3 games, 442 yards, 5 touchdowns, and he became the first player ever to have 3 different runs of 60 yards in a postseason career, and he did it in 1 postseason. So truly just a magnificent run for him in a way that the Eagles have that's kind of become their bread and butter with, Jalen Hurts is still a good mobile quarterback, but he's taken a step back as a passer, maybe at least plateaued. They looked at Saquon Barkley as like that's the thing that was going to put them over the top. And now they're trying to not just get to the Super Bowl but win it. So, like, what edge do they have going up against the Chiefs? It's clearly not going to be at quarterback. Defense, you could argue maybe, but that's Steve Spagnuolo's unit. That's pretty hard to top. The separator for them is the running back position. We'll see, in a couple of weeks how well that does. Maybe people come back and say a superstar running back can never just get you a Super Bowl title, and that's maybe fair. But to even get to this point, to get you in this conversation, to craft your entire identity, I think it was a great argument for the position. There's a couple of takeaways I'll get to. I don't know if I could I'll just throw them in the Saquon conversation overall that are similar and different to Jonathan Taylor. Basically, I think where it helps the Colts is the fact that obviously it shows you that investment can pay off, and namely the athletic feats of Saquon Barkley. That's what you are paying for. That guy that's just, you can't draft and replace this type of player. And we're talking about Saquon Barkley can run a 4.4 40 at 233 pounds. He's got some of the greatest lower body strength you'll ever see. That's how he was able to literally leap over a defender earlier this season. That's how he's able to cut on a dime, reverse course across the middle of the field. And it's so electric that obviously he brings a great rushing floor, but it's that ceiling when he can force a team to move down into single high safety. That safety moves to the middle of the field. You would think that's normally the way that you take away a run game, is bring a safety in the box. What it does against Saquon Barkley is it leaves one guy on that third level to make decisions from the middle of the field to try and chase down this guy who's faster, stronger, more decisive than he is. And that's where we're seeing those 60-yard runs. So that would be the argument for Jonathan Taylor, I think, because he's one of the only other players that physically can compete in this world. I don't know that I'd put anyone quite on Saquon's level, but think about Jonathan Taylor. He's also a 4.4 runner. He came in the league only 7 pounds lighter. And he has that just surreal vision, change of direction. He has a lot of these skills as a runner. There's another area that they're not the same in blocking and receiving that I think could factor into this conversation of, is Jonathan Taylor quite at that level that actually lets you do this? But as a runner, I think there's an argument for how the model that the Colts built in the backfield really makes a lot of sense. It's what the Ravens and the Eagles chased in this world of two high safeties. And Jonathan Taylor's speed, like Saquon Barkley's speed, is also an answer for when those teams then bring a safety down into the box. I just think Saquon Barkley, he about as demonstrably killed that running back narrative as you ever could have. And there's still going to be conversations about, overall in the big picture, how valuable is the running back position. But it just goes to show that, like, there's certain guys that are just a total cut above, and they are difference makers, and they can be the best player in your team, and they can be the most important. And you can't just go out there and replace them. And I think what a smart team like the Eagles is the one that shows us this. I think that that carries a lot of weight too.
Yeah, it does feel like, and if you look at the regular season stats and some of the teams that got in, Barkley, by the way, at 442 yards in the playoffs so far. Jeez,
7 yards.
But looking at the just at the way the NFL went this year in terms of running backs, a lot more rushing than there has been in previous years. There were looks like 5 guys over 1,400 yards. The two high safeties and the shells that people are playing are really kind of opening things back up for the running back, I think. And in Saquon's terms, you see Saquon, Derrick Henry this year kind of proved, Josh Jacobs to some degree kind of proved a little bit, that those guys can still really hurt a defense. Like, and it does feel like the beginning of maybe a trend, unless defenses really close it off. Because, like I mentioned, that 1,400 yard figure, there were 5. There was just 1 in 2023. If you take it down to 1,300 yards and give Kyron Williams 1 extra yard because he was at 1,299, so we'll just round up. That's 7 guys. There was only 1 last year. It was Christian McCaffrey. 2022 had a little more rushing than that. Still not the same level as we saw this season. 2021 is obviously the Jonathan Taylor season. That's the season that the Colts probably came the closest to this, but they obviously had a worse defense and much worse at quarterback. But even in that season, the next highest rusher for the NFL that season was 1,259. It wasn't like there were a bunch of guys putting up sort of those mid-90s running back numbers. It does feel like, I always kind of go back to, if you ever watch the Manning cast and Peyton starts talking about what he would do against the two high shell, he always says he just run against it. He just run against it until you came out of it. And it feels like offensive coordinators and offenses in general are starting to do that. It'll be interesting to see how long it goes. But Saquon and what the Eagles are doing is going to make some teams I think, chase that a little bit, because what Saquon is doing is he's closing the gap for the Eagles with teams that have better quarterbacks.
Yeah.
Jalen Hurts is not on the level of Mahomes or Allen or Lamar, but he closes the gap for them a little bit, because not only because of what you said, but just because, you know, you can get yardage numbers out of him that are obscene and make it so that the passing game doesn't have to be as productive. So, yeah. And then I think one of the flip sides too is, like you see with some of these other teams, you know, Jackson and the Bills, like James Cook ran for, I think, is the second leading rusher in this playoff so far with 272 yards. You have to focus so much of your attention on Allen. It allows the running back to be an important player. So, you know, I think you're right. I think the running back thing is pushing back that way. That 2021 Colts team is kind of the closest. I saw somebody say, have we ever seen, somebody on X Twitter said, like maybe 2 rounds ago, was like, have we ever seen a team so dependent on the running back? I was like, yes, the 2021 Colts. They just didn't make the playoffs.
They were too dependent on them. They didn't have enough around him.
They didn't have any. Well, and the thing is, like, you look at the seasons from the quarterbacks there, like, again, where Jalen Hurts is like, we're not saying Jalen Hurts is great, but they can still throw it. They don't have to just, the Eagles don't have to just hand off to Saquon Barkley. And, like, I know that sounds kind of like obvious. Yeah, of course they don't have to do it. But really, by the end of the season, that Colts team, that's what they were doing. They were just handing off. And I think the biggest difference is the difference in the number of yards per attempt. The Eagles are at 8. Hurts is at 8 was at 8 for the regular season. Wentz was at 6.9. And I think in the back end of the season, it was probably way worse than that, because they weren't throwing at all. So, like, that's, from an offensive perspective, that was really what the Colts needed that season. They just needed Carson Wentz to be a little bit better. He didn't have to be great. He just had to be average, and he wasn't. But Taylor certainly was good enough.
Well, the Colts also didn't have that the Eagles and the Ravens have, and the Bills, like you mentioned, is another runner that adds to this, that quarterback element. Now, that didn't hold Jonathan Taylor back. I mean, he ran for 1,800 yards, but that's where it felt like every ounce of production had to come from him. And that's hard to just sustain all the time. Whereas, like, the Eagles, you know, they're running Saquon a lot, but he's at almost 7 yards a carry this postseason. And an element of that is having a quarterback, Jalen Hurts, 4 straight years he's run for at least 700 yards and 10 touchdowns. A lot of that's tush push, but it's still, to get 600, I think it's 600 plus yards 4 straight years. To get that out of the quarterback position, you know, adds to it. And then obviously Lamar Jackson is like basically a running back's production in his own way too. So that's where, like, to kind of expand this lesson a little bit, the Colts model, I think, makes a lot of sense in just the very basic level of, you paired a superstar running back with a freakishly athletic quarterback, and what that's going to do in the two high shell world. Just what they do to play off each other. It just, when it hits its high gear, it's almost impossible to stop. But like you said, part of hitting that high gear is you got to have some element of the passing game, got to have a better defense. Like, you have to round that picture out the way the Eagles have, with a great defense and a good enough passing game. But to me, this is a showcase of, like you said, it's kind of my big takeaway, is that the Eagles, they got a shot. If they're going to take down the Chiefs, it's probably because of Saquon Barkley and their defense. I mean, it's not going to be because it would take everyone to do it, obviously, but it's not going to be that Jalen Hurts is better than Patrick Mahomes or outplays him. That isn't going to happen. They have to compensate in another way. And these two high shells are making a guy like Patrick Mahomes into a very different quarterback than he used to be, this dink and dunk and methodical quarterback, and he's doing that. But the two high shells are making, you know, the Eagles drive down the field, but it's so much easier for them than other teams because of how that backfield is built with two guys and how dominant and explosive Barkley is, where he can still get those 60-yard runs, kind of no matter whether you have two high safeties or one high safety. So that's that. It's a good argument for the position. It's amazing to think of where we've come when just like a year and a half ago, all these guys were told like, no, you can't get any deal that's even reasonably above like the a bargain bin type of level. And now it's like the Eagles went out, they paid a running back, and it looks like a steal.
To add to your point on the quarterback run, the Ravens ran for about 700 yards, 650, 700 yards more as a team this year than the 2021 Colts. The Eagles ran for about 550 more yards than the 2021 Colts. In the case of the Eagles, that's pretty much just Jalen Hurts. That's pretty much just the difference between Jalen Hurts and Carson Wentz running that year. So that quarterback piece is one. I'm going to do a funny one right now. I'm going to do a funny one for my first one. The Colts need a better tight end. A better tight end would definitely help them get closer to the playoffs. But if they got to the playoffs, he'd probably be the reason that they ended up falling out of it. Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid. I didn't realize watching the AFC title game last week. On first watch, I was so consumed with the blitz, with Steve Spagnuolo's blitz call, which this will come up later in another piece of discussion, that I didn't really notice just how close Dalton Kincaid came to catching the Josh Allen heave there at the after the blitz, but he really should have caught it. So I think I texted that to our editor, Nat Newell. I think I texted him, the Colts need a better tight end. A better tight end would definitely help them make the playoffs. But if they get to the playoffs, the tight end will probably be the reason they're out.
Yeah, that was pretty killer. It's to build it all around that, and like, where else do you go with the ball? The guy you trust. I think obviously tight ends. I feel like every year we do this, and especially when I write it out, I focus a lot on the teams that make the Final Four. I think it's a good time to focus in on it and make it more than just one very narrow model. It's always like the best tight ends are just constantly in these games. Obviously, Travis Kelce's in it like every year, but George Kittle's been in it a ton, and then Mark Andrews going to be another one, and then Dallas Goedert. They just rarely does a team make it this far without a really good tight end. And you could also argue if the Bills had a better tight end who can catch an open pass when Josh Allen heaves it down the field on fourth down, maybe they're still in this. Even though, Dalton Kincaid, they've got a few guys that are pretty good. But especially the takeaway I have to build on this is that tight ends matter for every team, but I think they're really critical for the mobile quarterback because they're that player that kind of blends the run and the pass and fit both of them. So a guy like Dallas Goedert of the Eagles, like he's a big reason that Saquon Barkley can get the edge, and that he can work to the second level when Jalen Hurts pulls the ball and give him a chance to hit that second level in the run game. And then in the pass game, teams love to play zone coverage against these mobile quarterbacks so that they can keep eyes on the quarterback, play defenders stationary, kind of force them to try to force them to play more from the pocket and win with their arm. And those tight ends are the best at settling into those zones in the middle of the field, traditionally big catch radius, and can kind of work around all of that. That's why the Ravens went out and drafted Mark Andrews in that same draft as Lamar Jackson. You think about the Colts, what really stymied them was when teams went tons of zone coverage. Last year in any kind of man coverage situation, Shane Steichen could use motion and different matchups, RPOs, and just kill teams for doing that. This year teams went a ton of zone, and part of it's Michael Pittman Jr. wasn't as healthy, and you didn't have running backs to catch. But I think the tight end position just really killed the Colts. And obviously where Anthony Richardson is as a passer, but those two things are going to have to work in conjunction. The Colts tight ends this year, I had the numbers here. They were dead last or next to last in basically every category. Where is it? They were 30th in targets, 32nd in catches, 32nd in catch rate, 31st in first downs. And again, some of that is the quarterback, but I don't think you can look at these tight ends and say that like just a quarterback was holding them back. We looked at some of the numbers when Joe Flacco stepped in, was basically the same production for the tight end room. And they just don't have a guy that's built to catch. I mean, Mo Ali Cox can block, but that's that thing is those guys who can at least do some of both, or ideally even a guy like Zach Ertz or Travis Kelce, who they're primarily receivers, but they're not nothing as blockers. They're not just split out, slot receiver type guys. Those guys are just really critical to building this kind of offense that's going to have some balance to it. And so it's just ironic that Zach Ertz was out there for like very cheap deal, 1-year deal of less than $4 million. The last two Colts head coaches have coached him before. I think would have loved to have a guy like Zach Ertz. Just the stubbornness at that position when there really wasn't a lot to wait around on that they truly believed in. That's come back to kill them, and that's got to be the thing that they just throw their weight into this offseason. I think they need at least 2 tight ends. I would go out and I may overhaul the whole room if I'm them, with veterans and rookies, because if you're looking at how these young quarterbacks, mobile quarterbacks succeed, a guy like Jaden Daniels, it's because big part of it is he has a guy like Zach Ertz, that veteran savvy tight end helps lift him up. And then the higher gear, higher caliber one who can do both. Those kind of guys are, Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce. Those guys tend to just make all these plays in the postseason when you get there. So between the draft class and free agency, that's I cannot think of a bigger need for the Colts this year.
Yeah, to your point about looking at the whole playoff field as opposed to the ending ones, if you look at the entire playoff field, the only team really of the 14 that made the playoffs that doesn't have a significant receiving option at tight end is the Rams.
Yeah,
I went through and looked at. While you were talking. I went through and looked at all of them. Like in a lot of these cases, the tight end is the second leading receiver or the first leading receiver. I don't think I don't know that you necessarily want your first leading receiver in the Chiefs' case to have 823 yards. But they also have Noah Gray on there. Like the tight end is a big part of a lot of these offenses. The Rams are really the only one that I saw that didn't have somebody from that position high up on the list in one way or the other.
Well, and the Rams, that's because Tyler Higbee missed all but 3 games in the regular season, came back in the postseason, in 2 postseason games, had 50-plus yards in both games and scored a touchdown against the Eagles. And in the past, I mean, he's not on the level of, these other Goddard and Andrews and Kelce and all that, but that is a guy that at this point, in his 9th season has built a lot of rapport and he's still a key piece. And it's still a lot more than anything the Colts have had to throw to really since I've been here. I got here in 2021, and that was the end of Jack Doyle, and that it has just been such a wasteland. And we used to tie like the left tackle and the quarterback position here together. Like they were both just total wastelands and hurting each other and holding each other back. The Colts got in, they found a left tackle in Bernard Ryman. This has to be the other step, though, to, let the quarterback have a little bit more of a chance.
Tyler Higbee's in his 9th year.
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't ready for that. We're just gonna skip right past that. It's gonna process that and move on.
Yeah, he's a year younger than me, so he's still a young pup. We'll say that.
I'm just gonna process that and move on. I wasn't thinking of him as a 30-something vet.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else do you have as far as takeaways from the playoffs? What's your next one?
So the next one, just to get some of the more obvious ones out of the way before we get in the weeds. This is super obvious, but it's still worth talking through. You need a monster at quarterback in the AFC to even get into the game where you have a chance to dethrone Patrick Mahomes. So the whole league is after Mahomes in this way. He's won, 9 straight playoff games now. He's going for a 3-peat that's never been done before. So that he's winning, when he goes up against Brock Purdy and Jalen Hurts, he's winning when he goes up against the ones in the AFC. But in the NFC, you have a model that you can chase right now, at least, that can get you there. It can get you the NFC title or the Super Bowl, that can get you on the doorstep, that can validate, like, where you feel like once you're in that game, anything can happen. That's where the Eagles are, where they're like, it is still a one-game situation where Saquon Barkley, for the reasons we laid out, it's going to give him a chance. Who knows? He could have one historic performance. But to get into that moment, to have that chance in the AFC is very different than the NFC, where we've seen Jared Goff and Brock Purdy in the NFC title game last year. Brock Purdy's taking them to Super Bowl. Jimmy Garoppolo took the 49ers to Super Bowl. In the AFC, the only quarterbacks who have reached the AFC title game in the past 5 years are Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson. Lamar's only gotten there one time, and that's becoming more and more of his narrative of how hard it is for him to even get to the AFC title game. But you think about a guy like Josh Allen, I mean, he just put up one of the best seasons you'll ever see and has been just incredible in the postseason. And it's like, when is he ever going to break through and get to a Super Bowl? This used to be the conversation with, back when Tom Brady was doing his thing. For a lot of quarterbacks would only get to the Super Bowl maybe once. A lot of conversation about how Drew Brees won one Super Bowl. But like, to even get to the AFC title game is just really hard right now. And so where that applies to the Colts, you could take it one of two ways. The more obvious and true reality is that like they aren't even in any stratosphere of that. Like the amount of jumps that Anthony Richardson's going to have to take as a passer to get in this conversation, when right now Lamar Jackson as a passer is not quite there in the postseason as it is, and he's a possible 3-time MVP. That's a huge, huge jump. At the same time, though, there is obviously Josh Allen started a little bit rough in that way too, but the main thing is that like you have to chase that model as much as you can in the AFC, where like they could think about that draft, they're choosing between or they're looking out there, and it's Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Will Levis. Even a couple years in, it hasn't gone great for Anthony Richardson, but the idea of that type of superhuman athlete, dual threat quarterback who has the ability to get some explosive plays, that's mostly what you're going to need here. The Texans obviously made the best pick of that group by far so far. CJ Stroud, even he slid off late last year, but had a magnificent rookie year, 2 straight years of winning a division, winning a playoff game, but he hasn't come particularly close to the AFC title game. 2 straight years losing Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. That's just the bar is so high in the AFC, and it's not an inspiring thing to think about, except that you got to keep taking your shots at these guys, because at some point, before the Chiefs trade up for Patrick Mahomes, we didn't know what he would be. Josh Allen, there was so many polarizing opinions both ways on him that lasted for 2 years. And Joe Burrow, he's a kind of exception as the number 1 draft pick, but it took one magical year in college to get there, that no one knew what he was just a year before that. Like you got to keep going to that well, and you got to throw everything at building that guy and seeing if you can give him a chance. That's why they're on the Anthony Richardson roller coaster. It's just, of course, as freshman, it hasn't come together or shown great signs yet, but I still think when you're kind of looking back at what could they have done, what should they have done, they're not going to be in a better spot going for the like older veteran game manager quarterback. The model they tried a couple years ago, that's got no shot in the AFC right now. So like this is just the game you have to play, and it's about as hard to win as it's ever been.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that basically that's the story of the entire century. Because before it was the current group, I remember like it used to be like there's some losses sprinkled in here. But there was Brady beat Mahomes at 18. That was sort of like the passing of the torch there. The Titans made it the next year, and then it's the beginning of the run you just referenced. And there's a few other teams sprinkled in here, but like the AFC winning quarterbacks before that, Brady, Manning, Joe Flacco, Brady, Roethlisberger, Manning, Roethlisberger, Brady, Manning, Roethlisberger, Brady, and then you have to go all the way back to 2002 with Rich Gannon. So, and then and the losses in a lot of those games, not the winners, are one of the quarterbacks I didn't mention. You know,
Yeah.
or is one of the other quarterbacks that wasn't it that year. There's losses for Manning, there's losses for Roethlisberger. Like the story of the AFC basically since Y2K is you got to have a Hall of Famer or you're not going to make it.
Yeah, it's been quarterback driven since Peyton Manning and Tom Brady started doing battle and just made that the conference. So it's not something new there. I would say the one thing that I think has changed a little bit is that first of all, it's a little bit of a tighter group of the guys at the top, where like you had Phillip Rivers mixing in there, Joe Flacco would get to the AFC title game, in won a Super Bowl. It's a little bit of a tighter sort of upper echelon to where Lamar Jackson's only kind of barely in it. He's made it once. The other one is that you still would occasionally have that one-off of Blake Bortles in the AFC title game, Mark Sanchez in the AFC title game, or at least you're in it. And like honestly, the Jaguars probably should have won that game against the Patriots. They had a 2-score lead into the second half, and so like you want to at least be in some of these moments. It's just impossible to even get to that moment. Like it's starting to wonder, like, does CJ Stroud get there for as exciting as his career started off as? Obviously, there's so many years left that this is you would like to think, yes, eventually he will. But right now it's just a crazy run to have 5 straight postseasons where only one of 4 quarterbacks has made it. And for the most part, it's been it's really becoming even more tight at the very top. It's pretty much Mahomes and Allen, unless they happen to meet like the round before that, like they did the one year in the divisional. And so obviously only one of them can win, but like it is so hard to even kind of feel like you're at the table at all in the AFC, or at least like you weren't going to win it back. Probably weren't going to win it back then in those days with those monsters. The other thing too is that like at some point in there, Peyton Manning, Phillip Rivers, Ben Roethlisberger, Tom Brady, they all got old. So at least you could tell yourself into like, well, this is this can't last 10 more years. You can't say that right now with the ages of these quarterbacks that we mentioned. So that doesn't paint the most inspiring picture, except that to think that like the Bills took this exact shot. Maybe it wasn't the same league back then of these guys already established, but it was a little bit along the idea of that the AFC East that they lived in for so long, like some of the stuff you laid out, like they took that shot in that bed and sat on that roller coaster, and that's why they did it. And it's like I think it's worth discussing because I've seen a few people talk about like yes, when you talk about the quarterback position this offseason, Colts need somebody to push Anthony Richardson. They need someone to play if he can't go out there. But I don't think people should entertain the idea of looking at getting back on the veteran market. Like the Jets just tried that with Aaron Rodgers.
Like the old veteran market.
Old veteran, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, Aaron Rodgers did not have the same abilities he used to. But even if he had some more of them, I mean, the bar right now is too high for that to even have a chance. Like you have to take a swing like Anthony Richardson when it's there, and if it doesn't work, you keep swinging. I mean, that's life in the
AFC. My next one, I'm still kind of workshopping this. This feels like it's not like it's half formed, but I'm starting to think that the name of the game with defense in the NFL is this like this is a hard thing to break down because it's not the kind of thing that is easy to see on TV. They don't show you the coverage very often. I think it's even harder for fans and honestly for us to read. But it's disguised in some way or the other. I wrote a story earlier this week. I kind of saw Spags' blitzes on the final drive against Buffalo and got super excited because it's so hard to blitz Josh Allen, and he did really, really well. And I tried to like go looking for something in the blitz rates that wasn't there. But like the Eagles are there. Vic Fangio is not known for blitzing. What he is known for is disguised coverages, like running a bunch of muddled stuff out of his too high shell, making it hard to read. It seems like that's whatever, however you want to do that, whether that's blitzing, whether that's coverages, whatever you want to do. It seems like if you can't do that in the NFL defensively, you're in for a bad spot, especially when you get into these games against these quarterbacks. Because I could be wrong here. I don't think I think Buffalo is a simplicity scheme defensively.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chiefs look better on offense against Buffalo than they have all season, all of last season. Like,
happens every year they face them in the postseason.
yeah, it's the Chiefs' offense looked kind of pedestrian. Travis Kelce isn't what he used to be physically, and they look kind of pedestrian all season. And then they face the Bills, and Mahomes knows where to go with the ball, and it looks honestly awful from a Bills defensive standpoint. Like Buffalo had to score on every drive to do that. When the Bengals beat them, and when the Bengals almost beat them, came close in that other championship game. And the reason Anarumo became like a head coaching candidate was that he was changing stuff up. He was making it hard on Mahomes. He was confusing them. That feels like it's the name of the game defensively. However you're going to do that, you have to be hard to read. You can't do sort of what the Colts have done the last 7 years and have a dominant coverage and its principles dominate. Like, you can change up your coverages, but I think with Bradley and Eberflus, both of their dominant coverages sort of inform the rest of their defense. And they lean more towards the simplicity side. Like I said, this is a half-form take, but it feels like giving the quarterback some picture he's not used to is kind of the name of the game defensively.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a decent way to boil it down. Like, the post-snap picture has to look different than the pre-snap picture, because these quarterbacks in this AFC, like we just laid out, the quarterback play, not only are these guys like Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, not only are they like superhuman talents, but they're now experienced enough to they're like right in the prime, and they're just going to eat that up when that's what you're going to throw at them. And so I think the Bills are a good example, is that they're good enough the regular season against a lot of the quarterbacks they face to have a very good defense. They get the postseason, and they've just been a little too easy to get at because of the static nature of their defense. But I'd even say, to kind of build off this a little bit, I do think that like blitzing well is essential, and how much you do that is going to depend on the personnel you have and how much you need it with your coverage. But I don't like every team that's succeeded this postseason, I think, has blitzed to some degree. So like the blitz rate. So Vic Fangio has always been very not super high on blitzing. He's afraid of the explosive plays that gives up. And when you have a front like he has, a 4-man front, you don't need to blitz as much. But it's still worth noticing that like he's got some of these guys like Zach Bond and Nakobe Dean that he will blitz here and there. They kind of come at the right moments, and they kind of come with a certain purpose to it. And for him, it's been freeing Jalen Carter up for one-on-one matchups. So he'll blitz the middle of the line to make those guys make choices, and Jalen Carter gets a one-on-one matchup, and that's how he kind of ends up harassing Matthew Stafford and ending that game. So that's a version of it. You mentioned the Chiefs, what they do. They dial that up like on specific. It's kind of down specific. Notice the
fourth down blitz. Let's just give me like 2 seconds here. I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible, because I got so excited about that I watched it like 15 times on Sunday night. So the fourth down blitz that they hadn't called all game, Zach Kiefer from The Athletic reported that. He was at the game. The fourth down blitz, they line up 6 guys across the front. There's 2 linebackers standing. The defensive linemen are lined up. You can't tell who's coming or going. They had, I think, just previously rushed basically all those guys. And then the corner's lined up, and it looks like he's in coverage, right? So at the snap, the right defensive end and the right linebacker in the A-gap bail out, and they're going to cover. And the player that they left to rush the left side of the offensive line, right side of the defensive line was Chris Jones. So the Titans are obviously worried about, the Bills are obviously worried about Chris Jones. So that's the only person on that side of the line. And then if you watch Buffalo's center, he looks right, and then he looks back to the left, initially I thought he's blowing it because what the Chiefs did is they actually rushed 4 guys essentially from the B gap, head up on the B gap outside, tackle, safety, corner, and end. But also, how is he going to get out there? How's the center getting out there? They rushed everybody outside. And so what you ended up with was 4 guys on 2 guys. And then on top of all that, on top of having 4 guys against 2 guys, Karlaftis beat the living heck out of the Bills' right tackle around the edge. And so you get a jailbreak. Like just such a fun overload blitz with showing essentially, hey, all of these guys might come, 2 of them dropping out, and then it being an entire overload, but not just an overload to one side, an overload to one specific area of the right side of the Bills' offensive line.
Yeah, I'm glad you laid that out because I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here is like blitzing it's not just about the volume in the attempts. That it's like if you blitz a lot, because you're finding the numbers don't really back that straightforward idea up. It's how you blitz, when you blitz, and where, and doing it really well. And it's a nuanced conversation because it takes all that you kind of put in there. But the counter to that is when Notre Dame goes 0 blitz on Ohio State on 3rd and 11. Hey, they blitzed. For those fans who want to see the blitz, they blitzed. They left Jeremiah Smith 1-on-1 against the worst outside cover corner they had, and we know how that ended. So
I think that college, I think to some degree, although I will say that the one thing about the Chiefs blitz is that if you go back and look, I saw a fan video from the stands, and if you look at what the Chiefs did, they gave up. Like Dalton Kincaid was not like a little bit open. You couldn't see this on the tape, but like he was wide open, deep, and they just bet that it was going to get there. I do think, though, that in college, the defensive backs and the secondary coaching is not good enough to do the 0 blitz in that situation.
Yeah.
And really, what Spagnuolo ran wasn't necessarily a 0. Like you get some 0 in the NFL, you get a lot of 0 in the NFL, but it's not the way it is in college where it's like a static 0. You know, like Spagnuolo dropped 2 of those guys out, so it's a 5-man rush and 6 guys are back. That's kind of what you're talking about, like the complexity of it and how you do it. It's not just as simple as send everyone. Like I think the joke I made in my story was it's not the Remember the Titans scene where Will Paxton is going, I don't want them to gain another yard. You blitz all night. It's not that simple, but you can still use it in the same way you use coverages where I think the blitz adds a layer to what the quarterback's trying to read, because if you're bringing, like Anarumo loves to bring Kenny Moore, right? If you know the other team loves to bring their nickel and the corner is good at disguising it, which I've been told several times that Kenny Moore is really good at disguising when he's coming and knowing how to do that. If you're doing that, not only is he trying to figure out what your coverage is that you're disguising, he's trying to figure out who's in the coverage, let alone any of the rest of it. Like who's going to be there, who's dropping out, where are they coming from? It just makes it so much more difficult on the quarterback. And so much of the NFL, I can't stress this enough, so much of the NFL is based on, can we get the look we want for the play we want to run? And if we don't get the look when we make that play call, what's our check off of it? Like, so anything you can do to mess up that process and make it more difficult is extremely valuable. Like, it's not just the great quarterbacks are the best at it, but that's what the bad quarterbacks are trying to do, is figure out what the look is and go off of it. Anything you can do to muddy that picture for them and make them think a little bit longer is better for the defense.
Yeah. And that'll bleed into my next takeaway to continue the conversation on this, which is to be able to blitz well, you need good blitzers. And so I think there's a lot of, like, when people are frustrated, like, why don't you blitz more? Why don't you blitz more? That's been the conversation with Gus Bradley and the Colts. Well, there was a stretch where they did start blitzing more. You just didn't notice it. You didn't feel it because some of the guys they were blitzing were not really suited for it in the end. EJ Speed just doesn't seem to disguise it and time it up as well as you would like. It became a little obvious when he was blitzing. Maybe some of that's how they coach it, but that's also not a young player. He's and then Zaire Franklin, it's just not his skill set. When he's had to blitz, he doesn't have the get off for that and the straight line speed to do that as well. So the Commanders run the same base kind of defense as the Colts did. Dan Quinn formed his in the same place in Seattle, and that was low blitzing back when you just could line everybody up and dominate that way. But they would do it a little bit with KJ Wright. He went out, and the Commanders went out and they signed 2 linebackers this offseason, Bobby Wagner, right from those Seattle days, to be the Mike, and then Frankie Louvu. And Frankie Louvu, the same contract Zaire Franklin just got, so it's sort of a similar investment idea, but they wanted to be able to blitz one of these guys, and Louvu came in with a really nice track record of doing that in Carolina. And then this year, he ends up becoming a second-team All-Pro with 8 sacks as their blitzer. And then when you watch him in the playoffs against the Eagles, that was sort of the only thing keeping that Commanders defense in it for a little bit of the game was those well-timed blitzes with Frankie Louvu. And that's where like you have to be good at when you call them, because they were doing that right when the Eagles were like at the edge of field goal range to take them out. Like there's a certain payoff to when they're going to dial it up. So while Kenny Moore is I've been wanting them to blitz him more for years. They did it more than Matt Eberflus, and then it just hasn't been a thing since then. That's a great fit, and Lou Anarumo's basically says he's going to do that. I just fear if that's the only guy you have that can blitz, and it's a cornerback, that just seems to be a little risky to me. So I would like to see another one at linebacker. Maybe that is in Jalen Carlisle's skill set. We haven't seen that as much. Maybe they can draft a guy and work that out. But I also think they should be open to signing one at that spot that EJ Speed is vacating, because the Commanders did that, and for as many flaws as they have on their defense, it helped them get by in a lot of moments by just winning certain situational money downs and messing up the field position at the right moments. And that, I think, could go a long way for this defense too. And also, like I mentioned with the Eagles, when they blitz their linebackers up the middle, it frees up Jalen Carter for one-on-one opportunities. I'd love to see the Colts be able to do that for DeForest Buckner in some of these obvious passing downs. So I just think there's a lot of value to getting a blitzer that's not just Kenny Moore, to where trying to guess which of these guys is going to come could be that could add to those challenges on the quarterback.
James Betcher might help with some of the technique stuff you're talking about.
Yeah.
Just kind of occurred to me while you were talking, like he came from Todd Bowles' defense,
Mm-hmm.
He was here in 2012. That was his first job in the NFL. And then he went with Arians to Arizona. Well, his first 2 years, Bowles was the defensive coordinator, and Bowles is always in the top 3 or 4 or 5 blitz rates in the league. Like that's baked into the scheme. He took over the Cardinals. I don't know a ton about what Betcher ran when he was with the Cardinals and the Giants. But like his background is in some of that technique and those systems that blitz a lot more. And so I wonder if that helps whoever they bring in at linebacker, because I don't think EJ Speed's back as the starter. I guessing that right now is always dangerous, because the part of me that's covered Ballard the entire time I've been here is going, he's just going to bring back his own guys, right? But I just don't think you should bring back EJ Speed as the starters. But like I also think that whoever you bring in, Jalen Carlisle's coming back as he continues his transformation into a linebacker. Like I think Betcher could help, just based on his background in terms of some of the scheme and how he does it.
Well, and yeah, just real quick, I think that also helped Zaire Franklin out, because Bobby Wagner is not exactly your do every single thing athletic linebacker at this stage of his career. It's amazing that he's still getting it done at his age. He's now 34 years old. But he's like, he can hang in coverage a little bit, but he's more your thumper type. But like he's insulated by a Frankie Louvu, where like when the Colts get to third down on defense and neither of their linebackers on the field are particularly skilled at that, I think it just really magnifies both of them, and they're both kind of put on these islands. It's something that has been an effect here ever since Shaquille Leonard fell off. I think Shaq covered up for a lot of that, or even like when Shaq was hurt at the start in 2022, and Bobby Wagner or Bobby Okereke was that other cover linebacker, third down linebacker with Zaire Franklin. Zaire Franklin that was his best season. So I think they could put Zaire in a little better place for his skill set if they have that other linebacker in nickel as a guy who can really offer something on third down, either as a blitzer or as a cover guy. So it's possible Jalen Carlisle is that guy, but I don't know. They can't bank on that. So when Chris Ballard, again, we'll see if he does what he always does. But if he does what he says that he's going to do this year, it would be bringing in competition and letting the best guy rise from that group. And I think they got to do that at linebacker.
Yeah, I was on the radio with friend of the pod Kevin Bowen and Andy Sweeney yesterday, and we kind of hit, I think, the thing we were trying to figure out how to like speak about competition. When Ballard says competition, he often means depth. Like he's bringing in guys that he sees as backups, right? And that's competition, right? But that's really depth. You're really bolstering your depth by bringing in somebody who you look at as a backup. Actual competition, real competition, is someone who can take the guy's job.
Yeah. If not, like, should take his job, because some of these positions, like linebacker, you play more than just two guys. So there's a sliding scale to it where it's like,
and I think even unless Jalen Carlisle takes this huge step at linebacker, unless he goes leaps and bounds, based on what we've seen so far, his best use is as a coverage linebacker. Yeah. That you limit his snaps in that way and put him in coverage type scenarios. Mm-hmm. Like you need someone for the every down, and it again, I hesitate saying this. It shouldn't be EJ Speed. It just shouldn't. They need a better player there.
Yeah, that would just that. Sorry to pick on EJ, but that would be.
I know. I feel bad.
It's a great case. It's going to be a great test, though, of whether Chris Ballard is going to evolve, because at this point we know what his skill set is and isn't. And if you bring him back, and there's not other investments, you are saying that we're just running it back at that linebacker group, which was not the strength of the defense this year. And there's, in doing that and just, drafting another guy in the 5th round, again, that's going to be the test. That would be the depth that Chris Ballard often adds. To add actual competition would be a guy that should start over EJ, or at least right there neck and neck if they are going to entertain bringing him back. But it's like when they have openings, like they can't do this at every position, or they're not going to, because guys are locked into these contracts. But at the spots where they can do it, that's where we're going to find out. Linebackers one, free safeties one. I'd say both cornerback spots based on just the investments there, the contracts, the health of the guys. Like there's going to be some very obvious spots where they should be doing this. So if they don't do it, that'll be the test, the tell to us that they're not changing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Because, like EJ Speed's 29, he's not hitting another level next year.
Yeah,
there's not another level coming.
Mm-hmm.
He's a strong side linebacker at best.
Well, he's a guy that, like, when his best moments were as a special teamer, and then when he was in that sort of like occasional role, like a lower snap level, you could just fight downhill.
Mm-hmm.
He had to play every down, and it just became very obvious what he can and can't do. That's where you're so static that you tell opposing quarterbacks, hey, avoid this in a guy's game and go after this. And to a level, that's Zaire Franklin too. But the reason that, like, you can, again, Bobby Wagner, if he was the only good linebacker in the Commanders, you could pick on him more than they did. He was a second-team All-Pro this year. And I guess Zaire Franklin was as well. But Washington got further because they were able to compensate for that. And that's what I think the Colts need to try to, like, the players that they have in the contracts that they have, they need to help out a little bit more. So it's like, that's linebacker's an easy spot for
that. You got any other takeaways from this?
Just a quick and obvious one is that when you bring in a new coordinator, give him cornerbacks. That's very helpful. So Vic Fangio arrived in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Vic Fangio got to Philly. He came from the Dolphins. It didn't go. It was just 1 year in Miami, but it didn't go super well. And he and Jalen Ramsey didn't seem to connect super well. And so he was inheriting this team that was going to play a little differently than he has in the past because it's such a dominant four-man front. But clearly the conversation they had with what he needed was better outside cornerback play and more options. And so they went out and spent their first 2 picks on Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. And DeJean becomes the slot, and Mitchell is an outside corner opposite Darius Slay. It puts less on Darius Slay's plate as he's 34 to be the only playmaker in the group. It also makes teams throw at him more and face his ball skills in the playoffs, which he's able to get a pick in man that way. And it just transformed the whole deal, where, like, the weakest position on the Eagles defense last year all of a sudden became one of their stronger points this year. And that's what's allowed him to really disguise the coverages, because the skill sets are good enough to disguise the coverage and play in different ways. Cooper DeJean's a guy who can play on the outside or play on the inside. There's a versatile element to his game. And yeah, that would help a lot, because especially as we talk about blitzing Kenny Moore, that is really risky to do if he's the only guy you feel good about in coverage. In fact, I have a feeling as we go back and look through Lou Anarumo, the blitzing went down over the years there, I bet, because of his trust in those outside corners. They were different. Trust is a bad word to use with a guy like Eli Apple. I understand that. But he was the number 2 to Chidobe Awuzie, who he did have a lot of trust for. They let those guys go, and they did the thing that the Colts have done, which is, hey, we drafted these guys, other guys in the 3rd round, let them be the starter now. And the trust levels fell off, and they just were not able to mix up coverages the way that Lou Anarumo did at his best in the peak in those playoff games. So, like, Lou Anarumo's a secondary-based coach. At least that's how he builds his defense out. That's kind of how Vic Fangio does. He builds his defense out from the back to the front more than the reverse of that. Those type of guys, you should give them investments, and cornerbacks always help.
Yeah, I also think that one is maybe like a note, like an asterisk or a footnote on that. I think it's gonna be really hard to do what the Eagles did with the first 2 rounds of the draft. I think you could convince yourself, we just take corners back to back and it'll be fine. I think it's probably harder to do that than I think the Eagles landing on 2 starters is probably like. What I'm trying to say here is, if Chris Ballard thinks I'm going to remake the secondary by just drafting people, that's not the lesson. Bad lesson. Getting him new players, getting Anarumo better players and new players at corner. Yes, absolutely do that. Definitely at safety. Expecting it all to come from the draft. I wouldn't look at what the Eagles did, because the thing that the Eagles did is the reason they can take those 2 guys in the first 2 rounds of the draft is that the Eagles are always aggressive about filling every hole. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't leave them with, a ton of glaring spots. You can do that when you're, bringing CJ Gardner-Johnson back and all this other stuff that they did. Like, Ballard doesn't traditionally do that. He usually has multiple places he's got to fill. Like, if you want to do that, if you want to like completely follow the Eagles route and do the draft thing, you better sign a bunch of people at other spots so that there's essentially no other hole but corner.
Yeah, I don't think they should do that, but they could do half of that. They could draft 1 instead of 2.
Draft someone, but just don't, like, assuming you're going to get 2 starter level players from the draft because the Eagles did, doesn't it feel like one of those things that Ballard would be like, well, the Eagles drafted these 2 guys, and you just look at them and you just think, we got to double down on the draft. That feels like a Ballard thing to me. Yeah. And there's enough secondary talent on the free agent market that you maybe shouldn't, yes, draft one, but maybe don't put all your eggs in that basket the same way. Unless, like I said, unless you're going to sign as many people at other positions as the Eagles do.
Yeah, and the Eagles could do it. They had C.J. Gardner-Johnson and Darius Slay. So the guys they drafted were in lower roles than what happens here, where Juju Brents was supposed to be the number 1 outside corner this year. Based on what? I just don't know what that was ever based on to believe that even if you set the injuries aside, there was nothing proven in the play to believe that was there. He's a second-round pick. Cooper DeJean is a second-round pick, and he was the Eagles' number 3 versus the number 1 on this team. That's the difference in the trickle-down effect, is that Quinyon Mitchell got to be a number 2 opposite Darius Slay, who would line up on your top wide receiver with the help of C.J. Gardner-Johnson. So, yeah, that's the problem, is the Colts pin too much on the rookies. We're they've got to come in and be everything because of the absence of veterans at these premium positions. And so I don't know how you exactly fix that at cornerback right now, because I like the options in the cornerback class in free agency, but they're not Pro Bowl, all pro. Those guys just don't really get there. So it's going to take more than – they're not going to create the Eagles secondary this year. But they should give a higher level of investment than they have to it, which in the past has mostly been I feel like every conversation we have about the Colts cornerback, even in a positive way, is hey, well, Samuel Womack did a nice job for a waiver claim. Or Jalen Jones has turned out pretty well for a 7th-round pick. There's always a caveat to it based on the low investment and what you're trying to squeeze out of a very narrow route to answering this critical position. Whereas the Eagles never had that conversation. They didn't say that Quinyon Mitchell was a first-round pick. That's a first-round talent. They're not all going to work, but at least we're not trying to squeeze something out of a much lower investment. And so it would help. That's all.
Anything else from the playoffs?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Like we said, we're kind of in the quieter part of the off season right now. There will be draft picks that are coming from the Senior Bowl. Trying to figure out which ones is not an exercise that generally goes well. Unless you you can just cast a wide net. I could say, here's 30 prospects from the Senior Bowl who might end up being Colts someday, and I bet I'll get a couple right if I put 30 out there. But the Senior Bowl's going on, but we're kind of in the doldrums as far as Colts stuff right now. Like we said, Nate's working on film stuff. Colts still filling out their staff a little bit. We'll see where everything goes. I think really the only open position we know about right now for sure is defensive backs. There might be some lower level stuff behind the scenes. But yeah, not a lot going on. We're going to try to continue to give you guys as much Colts stuff as we can. For the IndyStar, I'm Joel A. Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. And we're on February.